Well, welcome everybody to the July Soils Network of Knowledge webinar. Now I'd really like to introduce Neil Griffiths, who's presenting today's webinar, Poultry Litter and Alternate Fertilisers. Neil has spent most of his working life as an agronomist with New South Wales DPI based in the Lower Hunter Valley. Due to location and interest, most of his work has involved pastures for beef and dairy cattle. Historically, the Hunter and Central Coast regions have been a major poultry production area, which means large amounts of poultry litter to dispose of, and hence his interest in using poultry litter on pastures. Neil is currently the Technical Specialist for Pasture Production, a role that has statewide responsibility for all aspects of pasture and fodder crop agronomy.
Okay, thanks Luke, and thank you everybody for your interest and time this morning. What I was going to do is run through, as the title and Luke has said, a bit of work that we've done over time on chook litter and also some of the alternate fertilisers work. So this is a bit of a potted history, I guess, over a few years of work, and hopefully at the end of the presentation we'll get a chance to have a bit of discussion and hear what other experience you guys have got, and you know, progress a bit of interest in the topic, I guess. So just to start with, a little bit of background for chook litter, particularly in this Hunter and Central Coast area where I've spent most of my time. And that's a typical scene as you drive around the area, that you can see this fence line affect quite dramatically. That naturally most of the Lower Hunter, particularly in the hill country, is relatively low fertility, native pasture or naturalised pasture now with lots of carpet grass and relatively low productivity, low quality pastures. And on the other side of the fence at that time we've got kikuyu, and that paddock at other times of year will be covered in kikuyu. Basically we have a dairy farm on the right hand side and a traditional beef grazing property, low input or no input, and that paddock would traditionally run bullocks on it virtually. So that's I guess what we've seen over time, certainly as long as I've been in the area, that scene has been repeated time and again. And it brings up, I guess, a couple of the fundamental issues as far as where chook litter fits in this region, and now getting into other areas as production expands in other districts. In that we've got on one side of the fence here, we've got a history of chook litter and soil tests that show you know, relatively high fertility levels, and the concern there has been you know, potential nutrient runoff with implications for water quality has been the main issue in this area over time. And so for half the people I talk to about chook litter, it's almost a case of sort of telling them to cut back or stop using chook litter altogether on traditional country. And on the other side of the fence, we've got an area which can use those nutrients. So it's really trying to get the chook litter used more widely to get full benefit and avoid any of the environmental concerns that we may have had. So just some background then, and for those that aren't particularly familiar with chook litter, we're using it basically as a fertiliser, so as a source of nutrients. There's organic matter there, and when we talk about poultry litter, we've got two or three different things. The main one is from the broiler industry, so that's a mix of bedding material, straw and sawdust and the like. But in other situations you might have, particularly from traditional cage egg production, it'll be pure manure that you're dealing with. So there's nutrients there, there's some organic matter if you have the bedding material. There's a range of trace elements. Zinc and copper are probably the main two that we're interested in, but a range of others, and I'll show you some levels later on. And that's always a dual-edged sword. In a deficiency situation, then they're a trace element and quite valuable. But if they're applied in too high levels, then we're looking at you know, heavy metal pollution problems. And of course, all of this stuff has moisture in it, which is one of the reasons why in most areas poultry litter will be traded on a volume basis, so it's a price per cubic metre rather than a price per tonne, and that gets over the largely over the issue of variable moisture content in the litter or manure as you're buying it. That varies in different areas. So just to give some idea of the nutrient levels, that this is a survey we did back in 2010, and broken here into broiler litter from tunnel ventilated sheds, which is the main form at the moment, probably across the world, but certainly in New South Wales. In this area we were relatively late because of considered to be a relatively mild climate. Our traditional broiler litter sheds had open sides and so forth on them. They weren't full tunnel ventilation. Those sheds are managed slightly differently, so I've got the two listed separately there. Turkey litter. Turkey is a much smaller industry but quite significant, and there are differences in the nutrient content of the litter that we'll touch on in a moment. And for comparison, there's just the straight layer manure in there as well. We've found out since doing this survey that at about the same time there was quite a big survey done through South Australia and more recently another survey in Victoria, and they've come up with similar nutrient levels that we're talking about here. So if we go through, we're looking at about 25% moisture on average, but quite variable. The way the sheds are managed, if they have problems with drinkers or anything, sometimes that you'll get batches of litter that are wet, or parts of the shed that will be wet. The salt level there doesn't really mean anything except that there's salts, there's nutrients in there. pH is alkaline, but it's not having a liming effect. Most of that high pH is due to ammonia. Historically, go back 20 odd years, they were using multi-batches in the shed, so they might have a load of sawdust and they might run up to sort of 4 or 5 batches through the year and have an annual clean out. And when they were doing that, they may have put some lime in between batches. So back in those times, the chook litter may have had a liming effect, but this high pH now is due to the ammonia, and we're not expecting a liming effect despite the pH being up there in some, as you can see, nearly 8.5, similar to lime. Nitrogen historically used to be what chook litter was used as a fertiliser. People would see the nitrogen response and they'd be using it as a nitrogen fertiliser. Since I've been involved, we've tried to change the focus more to phosphorus, because the nitrogen is hard to manage in many respects. It's you can see that there we're looking at 3-4%, the layer manure 5.8 on average, but it's highly variable, and it's really just like putting urea on a paddock. So if you put it on under good conditions, the nitrogen will be effective. You put it on when it's hot, windy, all the sort of conditions when you wouldn't want to use urea, then you'll lose most of that nitrogen. So it's there. If you can capture it and use it, it's a great bonus, but it is tricky. People used to think that we were getting slow release effects, and it was so much better than other fertilisers. And I'll run through in a moment a little bit more on this, but really I'm saying, as far as chook litter is concerned, if you use it like you'd use urea, then you'll get the benefits of the nitrogen. You can see the other one that we're particularly interested in is the phosphorus levels, and there have been some significant changes in the last 10 years with phosphorus. You can see here, I don't know that the difference between the tunnel ventilated and conventional sheds is particularly significant, but we're looking at about 1.1% phosphorus. You can see the turkey litter is higher at 1.7 and the layer manure higher again. That's a significant change on what we saw when we did a similar survey about 10 or 15 years earlier. At that time, the average phosphorus on our broiler litter was about 1.8, and the turkey litter was similar or slightly higher. In recent times, they've actually changed the way what they're feeding the chooks and how they feed them, so there's less phosphorus in the diet now, and layers and turkeys get different diets as well. So what we see in the manure very much reflects what's in the diet originally. But the important thing is that we haven't got as much phosphorus in broiler litter nowadays as we may have 10 years or more back. So some of the things that I'll be talking about with some of these changes, particularly the build-up in phosphorus in the soil and the way we value poultry litter, or not the way we value it, but the actual value of the chook litter has changed because there's now less phosphorus in it, it would seem. And as I said, those sort of numbers are reasonably consistent across the few surveys that we've seen. Potassium's the other one that we're particularly interested in here, and there's a useful amount of potassium in litter, and you've got, as you can see, there's a whole range of other things there, but it's mainly the NPK that we'd be using to compare value of chook litter with the with the alternatives, whether they're normal fertilisers or other organic products or whatever it may be. So when we look at chook litter and how it works, basically birds excrete uric acid, and very quickly it's turned into urea, like all nutrients, relying on biological activity to create most of those changes. So, this will have already started to happen before in the sheds. In the case of broilers, they might be in the sheds for 5, 6, in the extreme 7 weeks, so it's not long. Quite high stocking rates, build up of manure, and obviously the early manure is going to start changing. That's why we start getting releases of ammonia, or it can go through as urea in the soil. The processes are the same. There will be some genuine organic nitrogen there. That would be by decomposition of things like feathers, or it shouldn't be dead birds. They should be cleaned out of the sheds, and they're not supposed to be in the litter at all. But spilled feed and so forth will have some, and that'll be the form that would give you your slow release nitrogen. Otherwise, as I said, for practical purposes, if we use poultry litter like we would use urea, then I don't think we're going to be far off the money. So it's not slow release, nitrogen highly available from the poultry litter. The amount of ammonia will vary enormously, largely related to how wet or dry the manure is, but also whether it's aged or not. So highest nitrogen levels are going to come from litter straight out of the sheds. If sometimes it'll be stockpiled and just left in a paddock for a while, the whole time it's in the paddock, you'll be losing nitrogen. Some of it may be because it gets wet and you're losing that ammonia, but also you're getting a breakdown, a composting process happening. And when we've tested aged litter, it's not properly composted because generally it's just been dumped in the paddock, it hasn't been turned or anything. And if you look at the carbon-nitrogen ratios, they're not ideal for composting at all. But that aged manure that might have been sitting in a heap in a paddock for 6 or 12 months, generally very low nitrogen levels, maybe down to 1% nitrogen or something showing up there. So that's where the nitrogen will vary quite widely depending on how the litter is managed. The point at the bottom there about 70%, assuming 70% of nitrogen available in year of growth, obviously that varies depending on when it's applied, the conditions and so forth. That was actually a figure that I saw quoted from a lot of American stuff, and they've done, because of the size of industry and everything else, there's a lot of information on poultry litter available from America, and that was a figure that was being used there, and it's as good as anything we have. But I think the main point is to remember that it's highly variable, and you would use it in it as you would urea to get a good nitrogen response. Phosphorus is a little bit different. That, as I mentioned earlier, that's what I've been focusing on, saying basically if we use poultry litter as a phosphorus fertiliser, when soil tests tell us that we need phosphorus, we avoid most of the overuse issues that we had historically, and we also get best use out of the out of the poultry litter as a fertiliser. If you're applying litter in a situation where soil tests tell you you've got excess phosphorus, well, immediately that's got no value, and once you take the value of phosphorus away from the litter, then there's probably more cost-effective alternatives available. So that's really the driver of efficient use of poultry litter, is using it around phosphorus. I haven't put the numbers up on the slide, but when we've had the when we did the testing of what nutrients were in poultry litter, we had the phosphorus component. We did water soluble, citrate insoluble, exactly the same as you would see on a fertiliser bag, to be able to make some sort of comparison, and it comes out that about half, slightly less than half, it might, 40 to 50% generally of the phosphorus in poultry litter is in a water soluble form, and about a similar amount is citrate soluble. There's a very small amount, and it might be, usually less than 10% of the total phosphorus might show up as citrate insoluble. So the phosphorus, we actually can get some slow release over it. Never seen any work that's sort of saying that that's more efficient and effective, but there's a fair logic there that there's that potentially putting that phosphorus on, getting us some water soluble and some slow release phosphorus could potentially be a more efficient use as far as plant uptake and availability over time. So again, using that that American guideline suggesting, if you're doing your budgets, maybe expect 80% of phosphorus to be available in the year of application. If we look at what happens with reactive rock phosphate or superphosphate, if you applied the same logic, I expect that the 80% estimate from chook litter would be pretty effective and attractive compared to some of the alternatives. So looking at using chook litter, it is a manure. It does have an interesting smell that not everybody appreciates, and there's potential pathogens and biological activity in there. So it's right that we do be concerned about it. We need to make sure that it's used properly. So from a neighbour or social perspective, environmental perspective, the dust is obviously an issue. Smell is a bit of a will-o'-the-wisp, but it can be a major concern, particularly in a closely settled area like around here. Water pollution has been one of the big drivers in the Lower Hunter, particularly in the Newcastle water supply area, and we need to be able to manage those things. So when we're using chook litter, we need to be sensible as far as workers are concerned, and sometimes people get a bit blasé when they're working with this stuff all the time, but obviously washing hands, concern about dust and so forth when we're using it, and neighbours are obviously need to be considered. Wind direction, and there'll be some areas that are just not suitable. Now, in our area, those sort of things can be major issues. I would expect that in broader scale farming areas, then hopefully they'll be less of an issue. But it's interesting, hearing some of the publicity going on around Tamworth and so forth, that the issues still apply where people are concerned about these things. As far as the water pollution, which has been a focus of some of our work, it's basically the same general principles that you'd be using for any sort of fertiliser. So based on soil tests, do we need the nutrients in the first place? Using buffers, and there's all sorts of debate over how big those buffers should be, but in a trial that I'll talk about in a moment, we just used a 20-metre buffer. It helped. It didn't solve the problem, but it certainly helped, ensuring that we've got ground cover or incorporate. In this area, we don't like to cultivate because we're concerned about erosion if we get storms and so forth on steep ground, but at least maintaining ground cover, it'll help. Avoiding runoff events. We want a bit of rain to wash the stuff in, but avoiding runoff events. So if anyone can ever tell me when we're going to get a flood, then I'll tell you when not to use poultry litter, and it'd say exactly the same for any other fertiliser. And with this stuff, we've got the dumps being put around, so where it's dumped or being stored, we want to make sure that that's in an area that's not immediately adjacent to watercourses, and in some cases maybe try and do some bunding or something to stop runoff getting into those storage areas, anything to stop the litter getting into watercourses. Being a manure, there's potential pathogen issues, and some years back you might remember there was a lot of publicity and a lot of concern about a thing called mad cow disease. At that time, poultry litter was looked at, and you might think it's strange why you're worried about poultry litter and mad cow disease. The scenario was that you can't feed ruminant products to ruminants, but you can feed meat meal to poultry. And the concern was that if there was meat meal in the chook feed spilled on the ground and was then spread in the litter, you can see how the disease cycle could complete if that's then spread on a pasture with animals grazing it. So as part of that, and more realistic concern about things like botulism and salmonella, we always suggest that you want to leave it at least 3 weeks after spreading. In the winter time, when it's cool and overcast, pathogens would last longer out in the paddock, so it would need to be longer. But as a guide, we've suggested 3 weeks, which in a dairy grazing situation you can manage, but just needs to be aware of that. Before we started saying things like that, people would use poultry litter as they would superphosphate, throw it under the cow's feet, and certainly talking to vets in this area, they've not had problems. There has been over time a few concerns with botulism in different areas, and that's been attributed back to poultry litter, so you do need to be aware of it. And if people are particularly concerned, they can vaccinate for botulism. The other thing that the mad cow thing highlighted was that stock don't have access to these storage areas, hence this is fenced off, and it is illegal to have ruminant animals in a paddock with chook litter. I'm not aware that anyone's ever been taken to court over the issue, but it's possibly a matter of time that before that happens, and it's certainly a message that we're trying to get out because of the potential disease risks, and it's potential more than actual. But we do need to be aware of these things, and we do want people being seen to be doing the right thing and keeping stock well away from storage areas and keeping them off paddocks that have had poultry litter spread on them recently. Just moving on then, when we did that survey in 2010, we also tested for trace elements and heavy metals, and you can see some numbers there. One of the ones that we'd be interested in particularly is arsenic. Arsenic, it historically used to be used as a growth promotant, but it's good to see that there's no arsenic being detected at level of detection there with when we did this last survey. Cadmium you'd be interested in, concern about cadmium in phosphate fertilisers. No cadmium showing up again at that level with the chook litter. The ones that we're most interested in would be copper, and there is copper in poultry litter, and zinc is the other one. Copper and zinc are the two that will be in poultry litter, partly due to feed and management. And if you compare them to the biosolid standards, both of the copper and zinc are slightly higher than the Class A standards, I think, but they certainly well within the Class B, which is the agricultural standard. So in some situations, copper and zinc might be used as a trace element fertiliser, but we don't want them building up too much. Other things, lead, there's none there. Selenium, certainly in this area, the vets are concerned about selenium deficiency and would probably be happy to see a bit of selenium, but we can't help them with that one. Just to illustrate the point with repeated poultry litter use, this is some numbers from a farm at Gresford that did a little bit of soil testing and used a fair bit of chook litter over time. When you look at the years, this was back when the poultry litter would have had a bit more phosphorus in it, and maybe that pH has snuck up, so maybe some of those early ones might have had a bit of lime in them as well. You can see that it's built up sulphur level, But the one that we're most interested in, as you can see there, the coal wall phosphorus has gone from being grossly deficient to grossly in surplus. So putting on chook litter when you've got those sort of soil test results is not economical, and environmentally you've got to have more risk of phosphorus runoff in watercourses. So, the message to these guys in 2006 was, stop using chook litter, or at least stop using it on these paddocks. So this is just where that bit of soil test history came from. It was a paddock that would have started off growing couch grass and carpet grass, and if you were lucky, you might have been running a cow to about 4 hectares or something back when it started. After the history of poultry litter, growing kikuyu and ryegrass as good as anywhere, and probably running 2 or 3 head to the hectare and wasting feed. So that build-up in phosphorus is pretty consistent. Just about everywhere we've looked at that's had a history of using chook litter, that's happened. You can see that we've had a build-up in potassium and sulphur in this particular situation. That's not so consistent. When we soil test, sometimes the chook litter will have enough potassium and sulphur to meet requirements. Sometimes, particularly if you start like this that's grossly deficient, we'd be saying come in with muriate of potash, come in with the sulphur fertiliser or gypsum or something to build them up. We can't rely on the level of sulphur and potassium in the litter. We can't rely on it. It's something that we need to check with the soil tests to see whether we're getting adequate sulphur and potassium coming in. So basically what's happened is where we've used chook litter, at rates that it's commonly used at, you might have 3 to 6 months worth of nitrogen, you might have 2 to 3 years worth of phosphorus, and the sulphur and the potassium may or may not be adequate. You just need to keep checking that. So one of the trials that we've been running here at Tocal started nearly 14 years ago now. It started off as a nutrient runoff trial. So you can see here we've got plots 100 metres long by 50 metres wide, and there was tipping buckets at the bottom where we caught runoff, and we were interested in nutrient runoff. We have 6 plots, 3 treatments. So 1 treatment gets poultry litter annually, 15 cubic metres of poultry litter annually. We have a treatment that gets the equivalent amount of nutrients, what we estimated the NPK to be going on in the poultry litter. So at the start of the trial, we did 3 years where we were using DAP and urea and muriate of potash to put on about the same amount of nutrients. Since then, so for the last 10 or 12 years, we've stopped that, and we've only used urea on those plots. And our 3rd treatment is our so-called BMP, which gets poultry litter every 2nd year and urea every 3 months. Looking at pasture production, it's measured using pasture cages, and you can see that they're reasonably significant. For the first few years we had a bit of a build-up. Now that area, when it was selected, had good soil fertility. It had some history of poultry litter, and it had adequate, I'll show you the levels in a moment, but it had adequate nutrients. We're really looking at that situation where we were telling people to cut back on using poultry litter. That was the sort of scenario that we'd started with, and after the first 3 years, we changed a little bit, and we've stopped doing the runoff work, but we're still maintaining it to doing annual soil testing, or we're back doing that now, and trying to look at pasture production. So you can see over time we were getting up to 20 tonnes of dry matter production, and different years, different treatments. So our nil comparison is a buffer area at the bottom of that BMP treatment. There's a 20-metre buffer that's had no fertiliser on it. It turns out that it is actually a slightly different soil type, but that's as close as we've got to a nil in this limited trial. Remembering it was set up originally to do runoff work rather than what we're using it for now. So over that period, if we add up the total amount of dry matter produced, you can see that the poultry litter is slightly behind the the other products, but costing it at the cost locally at the time, which was costing poultry litter at about $20 a metre, it was quite a bit in front of the alternative fertilisers. Now remember, this is a situation where we were really only getting value out of the nitrogen in the poultry litter because the phosphorus levels in that paddock were already adequate, the sulphur and the potassium and so forth were already adequate. So other situations, if poultry litter is dearer or fertiliser is cheaper, then the numbers will come up differently. But that's just to illustrate what had happened with the results that we had from this area. And I guess the combination of poultry litter plus extra nitrogen doesn't look too bad from a cost perspective, and from an environmental perspective, it's looks a bit more attractive as well. So just looking at soil test results on those areas, pH for a start, where we've used chook litter, it's dropped a bit, bearing in mind comments earlier. Where we've used only urea, remember we had only used urea for nearly 10 years now, we've had more of a drop in pH. Why this pH was a bit higher in this last year that I've shown there, 2010, may relate to now the test period or whatever, but the trend is certainly that pH has dropped more where it's only been urea used. Phosphorus levels with the litter, I said we started off on this soil, we probably only need about 50 to 70 parts per million coal wool. We started off with more than enough, and where we've used annual litter, it continues to go up. Where we've used no phosphorus going on in recent years, we are dropping, but still adequate after quite some time. And the potassium levels have dropped quite significantly across the board, as you can see there. Yeah, just changing onto the alternate fertilisers, we had a question some years back, particularly from dairy farmers. They were being offered a range of products, getting regular inquiry and so forth about alternate fertilisers. Now, in our trial, we were looking at focusing on nitrogen. That was their question. They were looking at alternatives to urea for top dressing fertilisers. In Kikuyu, and again, this is Kikuyu. You can see this is a spring photo. We've got some Kikuyu here, and it's been oversown with ryegrass, which was the scenario that we were working with. So a range of products. We couldn't test everything, but we tried to use a range of products. Now that's a pretty messy looking slide, but if I just break it down for you, at the bottom here we have our nil. So this is our first season. So using first 3 months of ryegrass. And in that 3 months, the ryegrass has produced about 3 tonnes of dry matter. So we had some treatments there where we looked at urea at different rates and with some of the coatings that were meant to be more efficient. So you can see here 50 kilos of urea. So that's applied after each grazing. So basically all of these treatments are reapplied after each grazing or harvest in the case of the trial. So in this trial, we had urea at 50 and 100. We had green urea and NTEC urea, and if you run your eye up those, it doesn't appear that even though green urea and NTEC are more expensive than plain urea, it doesn't appear that they've given us any more pasture production. We had a biological nitrogen fixer on its own or with 50 kilos of urea per month. We had gibberellic acid here, either on its own or again with 50 urea, and then we had some organic liquids. Now, in each of these cases, the products were applied how the company said they wanted them applied. Within the constraints of a trial that was trying to maintain some consistent treatments, because there was discussion after a while of wanting to change the rates and how these things were used. So the initial applications were all at the rates applied. So if you look at the nil fertiliser and run your eye up that line, you can see that quite a few of the alternates don't seem to have done a great deal. The exception at this site might have been some extra use. Gibberellic acid on its own didn't do much, but combined with the extra nitrogen, we did get a boost. It did better than the 50 kilos of urea on its own. These liquid products, when you look at the rate, they were often, might have been 10% nitrogen, but if you're only applying 10 litres of product, effectively you're only putting on one kilo of nitrogen per hectare versus our urea at 100. Well, that's obviously putting on 46 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. Again, these people were the ones that were out promoting themselves as alternatives to urea, and they were applied at the label rates and how they said they wanted them applied. At the same time, or immediately beside the first trial, we had a second trial which we called the carryover trial. And basically all treatments were applied once, and then they were harvested 3 times without any extra applications, and then they were reapplied again. So this is our harvest after first 3 applications. We've got similar treatments except in our urea we went 50, 100 and added a 200 kilo application. And we also added some poultry litter in there at both 7 and 15 cubic metres by comparison. And in this one we've also added a polymer coated urea, and it's gone in at slightly lower rates because the company selling that said it was much more efficient, you didn't need to use as much. The polymer coated urea was about twice the price of ordinary urea. If you plot out the results, it pretty much gave a similar sort of return per kilo of nitrogen as we were getting from the other types of urea. And again, you can run your eye up there. So the nil in this trial produced just under the 3 tonnes, so very similar to the first trial. And you can run your eye through looking at some of these products and how much extra growth might have been achieved by them. One of the big things that was being talked about, apart from supposed cost savings, and haven't got time to go through a lot of that, but you know, there was concern about feed quality from urea, and the benefits of some of the other products were going to give better feed quality. So we did some extensive feed quality testing. What we've got here is the amount of nitrogen applied. So our 200 kilo, and this was after at the first harvest. In the 1st of August on ryegrass. So we can see that we've got our high rates of urea and chook litter up the top here. So rates going up, and our protein levels kicked up a little bit at with those very high levels. We wouldn't normally recommend 200 kilos of urea. 100 kilos of urea would be a standard, or 50 to 100 would be the standard recommendation. 200, we wouldn't be recommending that level anyway. But yeah, slight kick there, but still not a problem. One of the things this trial also highlighted was some interaction between nitrogen management and grazing management and plant maturity affecting feed quality as well. So one of the big concerns with excess nitrogen is nitrate poisoning, and so you can see that until we get to those high rates of urea, we're not getting it, don't seem to be getting any kick at all in urea. There's one outlier here, and that was basically due to one sample. These are all averages of four reps. And in this one was one high nitrate test, which may well have been an old urine patch or something. So classic as to why we want to have replicated trials. To put that in some perspective, the animal health concern for dairy cows kicks in at about 1,500 parts per million. So even this one outlier was only about half the level that would cause health concerns. ME. So I've just got there how the yields increased with increasing nitrogen. ME is very good, so even our scale here starts at 11.2, which is very high quality feed, but we can see that there doesn't appear to be any problems with putting certainly 100 kilos of urea or so on as far as ME is concerned. So we're struggling to find any evidence that the alternate products had advantages from feed quality perspective. Same thing, that's our protein line as we saw before, just in scaled up with yield and putting the two together. So with the testing that we did, yeah, we struggled to find any evidence that there were feed quality concerns from using urea at the rate that was recommended, and at a double rate we still weren't running into problems. At the same time that we were doing the work at Tocal, there were similar trials going on at Taree and at Berry, and this is just a little presentation that Craig Muir put together with the Berry results, and I'll just sort of run you through that. So to start with, we've got our nil control here. we've got our 50 kilos of urea, our blue triangles, and our squares here are 100 kilos of urea. The Twin N was the biological product used, and you can see where it falls here. Twin N plus 50 kilos of urea is performing similar to the 50 kilos of urea. A range of the liquid products, Craig used a couple of slightly different things to what we used at Tocal, but the liquid products all gave similar responses to what we saw. We've added here using urea in alternate months, slightly below the urea, 50 kilos of urea every month, but following the trend that you can see there. The green urea and NTEC ureas added to that. So it seems reasonably consistent that the yield responses we got were pretty much summarised by the amount of nitrogen actually applied from the various products that were there, and there seems to be a reasonably consistent trend going on there. One of the other things that gets talked about with where you use any nitrogen, but particularly with urea, I hear people say that it kills out clover. So we used the opportunity in our second year. These are just a visual assessment that a few of us did, looking at whether we could see any effect where we've used the urea on the clover levels. So if you look down the bottom here, we've got the average of the trials, and at the top we've got the nil with our score. It's not a linear score, so as you can see in the bottom here. But when you run your eye down that, it's only rough, but it is an indication that that where we used high rates of urea, so in the carryover trial where we used 200 kilos of nitrogen, so at this stage it had been going on at that level for, the trials had been running for 18, 20 months when we into the second year, and where we'd consistently used high rates of nitrogen, there was a bit less clover, but certainly hadn't been wiped out. The other thing that's, I guess, to me that this highlights is that any talk about clover levels really depends on grazing management as well. So sure, if you go using high rates of nitrogen and let the grass get tall and rank, it'll smother out the clover and you won't see clover. And we see that commercially in paddocks quite regularly. But if you maintain your grazing management, keep the grass down, then the clover can persist through there. Biological effects, biological health tests and effects from using urea versus the other products was another big question. Now, we didn't have the time nor the budget to test everything, but we did test a few examples here. So you can see that our and these tests were done at Wollongbar, so the FDA enzyme test, no significant difference, and what we've done is looked at the nil control, we've looked at a couple of the organic liquids, we've looked at the biological N fixer, and we've put the 100 kilos of urea in there. From the biological carbon, there was some slight differences, and interesting, the one that was lowest there was an organic liquid. Don't quite know what you draw about that. At the same time, we did similar tests with the that chook litter runoff trial that I was talking about before, and found in it actually the highest FDA and BIOC results we got were actually on the urea treatments. So again, and that had been running for over 10 years. So that was only comparing urea with a nil and the poultry litter. So it didn't seem that the urea was causing big problems as far as these tests were concerned anyway. So when we had those trials, we ran field days talking about the results, and it was just interesting to me, and I'd be interested in your comments about some of these things later on, but it was interesting that despite trying to explain the results of the field days and putting out the numbers similar to what you've seen there were still people that wanted to spend money on using alternate products because they must work, and that was literally what I was being told. They must work. So my response was, if they work, how do they work? What do we need to measure to be able to show the benefit? Because they sound great, and we'd love to be able to support them if we could find evidence to do so. We measured pasture yield, feed quality, clover and that biological activity, and we couldn't find any evidence in and remember, this was only over a year or two, and it was focusing on nitrogen, but we couldn't find any evidence to support those the claims that were being made at the time with both the problems with urea or the benefits of some of the other products. Just to throw in some other information here if you're interested in the topic. So the work that we did at Tocal, Taree and Berry was on dairy pastures focusing on nitrogen. There's been quite a bit of work done in grazing situations, and there was a report done by Lewis Kahn for MLA, which reviewed 5 projects, 43 different soil treatments, including some of the things we did, plus mineral fertilisers and a range of other products. And the summary that I got out of that was that the thing that best predicted production in a phosphorus limiting environment was the amount of phosphorus that was applied, whether that was from superphosphate or a manure product or something else. If you are deficient in phosphorus, you actually need to put it on to get the response, and I guess it needs to be in an available form. And the treatments with the lowest cost of producing pasture were the ones that address the deficiencies that were showing up. Another quote, I'll just have to go back here. Another quote that I found interesting, Moffat's Farm is a website, and Patrick Francis has a background in media and publications, and similar thing, but and he's done quite a few reviews himself of different things. But I guess the quote is, when pasture yield microbial diversity are analysed across treatments on a few of these, again, phosphorus-focused things, it was products that contained nutrients rather than those adding biology, which had the positive impact on production. So there's a bit of a trend there when people have reviewed some of this work. There's a bit of a trend there that seems to be happening. So just to finish off, then, I guess it's back to basics when using these things from me. So if we're thinking about a fertiliser of any sort, whether it's poultry manure or whatever, any other sorts of additives, step one, identify what we need. Use the soil test, use nutrient budgets, particularly in more productive situations, and identify what nutrients we need. Look at the various options that are available, be it chook litter or anything else. Compare the relative costs of the different nutrients, and then measure response. Use test strips at least if you're doing something different, to be able to see whether we're getting benefit out of it. And I guess, an alternate fertiliser can become mainstream if it works. I talk to some people that consider poultry litter to be an alternate fertiliser. In this area, it's just the standards, it's just any other fertiliser. It's been used here for years and years. It's not considered alternate at all. And Luke, I might finish there. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. That's great. We do have one question from Karen O'Malley, which she's typed in. Karen's asked, is there any testing for residue from inputs such as sanitation agents or insecticides or things like that?
In the chook litter, I'm assuming. Certainly not that we've done. Doing a lit review years ago, pretty much anything that was applied to the chooks will show up in the manure. So there's work being done in Europe and America with looking at antibiotics and so forth. There's always talk about hormones. Generally, they're not there. The biggest genuine issue is the heavy metal one. I haven't seen anything with sanitisers. Certainly when they change batches, they do clean the sheds out thoroughly. I'm not aware of any residues in the litter, but I haven't specifically looked at that one.
Okay, thanks, Neil. And this is related. Karen said, any recommendations to help stabilise the ammonia/nitrogen to prevent the loss of leaching when removed from chicken sheds?
Not in practical terms. The industry has certainly looked at it because there's the ammonia in chicken sheds is a major health issue both for the chooks and the workers that are in there, so no one wants it. There has been work done using things like alum and various other products. They're not being used routinely as far as I'm aware. One of the big issues, but with that, particularly if they went down the alum route, is that it's going to tie up any phosphorus that's there. So that they may, and litter as a byproduct or a waste from chook production, the economics of that industry is very much on the production side. So if they could do anything to stabilise that ammonia, they would. But we would have to be then very careful about what happened with the what happened as far as the fertiliser value and any unintended effects like alum on phosphorus. So I guess I go back to first principles. The most efficient way of dealing with it is, and I guess that's partly why we've tended to say use it fresh, which is an issue. That compost might be a better product, and some people, particularly if they look at freight costs and so forth, would be using composted litter. But it does increase the relative cost of it. So from a nitrogen perspective, if we use it fresh and can get it watered in or incorporated, that would be probably as good as we're going to do. I'm not aware of additives at this stage that are going to help us.
Karen's just written in adding gypsum ?
Not aware that it would help.
Okay.
Just to finish off on that, just questions about lime as well. If you put lime on with urea, for example, you'll actually increase the nitrogen losses. So lime's not an alternative either.
Great. And Karen says thanks. So Claire, I'm just going to check if you're there, if you have a question. Here we go. Are you there, Claire?
Hello, Luke. Fantastic. Hi, Neil. Thanks for the presentation.
G'day, Claire.
I've got two questions. When we were doing our pig manure trial, I was doing my pig manure trial, we looked at soil tests which were quite deep. Did you do that, or was it just 0 to 10 that you were looking at?
No, they're just 0 to 10s. Well, sorry. Most of the stuff is 0 to 10. Some time back, yes, we did go deeper. We did some profile work, and and I particularly remember doing one under some old chicken litter dumps where people had been using it as a dump area for a decade or more, and there was signs that that nutrients had moved down through the profile. I think we'd got that, we were seeing elevated phosphorus down to about 60 centimetres, but that was under a dump area. At the rates that it was being used in paddocks, we weren't getting any effect. That was quite some time back, some work we did with Roy Laurie back in the day, and we were going down in profiles, and we're really only getting surface build-up.
Yeah, I wonder if it would be worth having a look at. As I said, we found bulges further down the profile with the pig manure after time, but that was on a very granite, sandy soil too. And my second question is actually from Peter Evans, who can't ask a question. Can you ask about the calcium from the layer sheds being 9% and its effect on sodic soils?
Yeah, look, the layers get a very different diet, higher in calcium, lower in phosphorus, so that would be sort of part of the explanation as to why it would be quite different. As far as effect on sodic soils, I was going to say, have no information, but there is actually some work going on in Victoria through La Trobe, where they've used chook litter, deep applied chook litter in sodic soils. So it's being drilled, I think, at sort of 60 centimetres into dispersing sodic subsoils, and they're getting huge increases in crop production. At extremely expensive, but I think the summary that I saw, they were getting paybacks within 18 months doing that. So I'm not sure whether that's from the calcium effect, or from organic matter getting down. But there is some work that you can chase up through Peter Sale and others at La Trobe that is looking at that subsoil application on sodic soils.
Peter Evans says thanks.
Good.
That's me.
Thanks, Claire. We have a great question here from Lucas Van Sweeten. Yeah, the important long-term trials. Thanks, Neil. Theoretically, litter is a waste and therefore needs EPA waste exemption licence. Lucas has had lots of arguments with EPA over this in relation to applying biochars from poultry litter. Compost has a general exemption. Thoughts?
Yeah, it's an ongoing discussion as far as I understand. I haven't been particularly involved in it. I guess with any of the guidelines that we used or anything, they're always sort of referred back to the biosolids guidelines, and I gather that EPA may be looking at it again. I guess I'll just make the point there as well that every state is very different in that regard.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much, Neil, for a lot of interest there. A lot of people have listened in today, so thank you very much. So thanks very much to everybody for attending, and particularly to you, Neil, and we'll finish the webinar now.
Okay, thanks everybody.